طيب, okay. طيب, so we're going to pick it up and we're going to try to accelerate a little bit because I don't want to fall behind and leave material from day one that we have to cover in day two. So we're going to have to pick up this pace a little bit. But inshallah ta'ala, we should be okay. We'll complete our introduction beginning with the prerequisites of obligation. So we said that the ruling of fasting was that it is wajib, it's obligatory. But every act of worship which is obligatory will have prerequisites for its obligation. Basically, certain conditions will have to exist before that action will actually be what? Obligatory upon an individual. So the ruling in general is required, it's obligatory, but that doesn't mean that it'll be obligatory on every individual until what? Until certain conditions are met. Does that make sense? So what I'm going to do is I'm going to give you the 4 conditions of wujub. And then we'll mention the 6 conditions of as-sihha, because now we have something else now, validity. That someone might be required to fast, but because of certain conditions that they have, fasting for them will not be valid. Does that make sense? Or you have some people who they're not required to fast, but it can be accepted from them because what? Certain conditions they possess. You guys see that? So we're going to touch on those 2 points, the conditions or the prerequisites for the obligation of fasting and the prerequisites and obligations for the validity of fasting. So for some people, fasting is not required, but it is valid if they do it. They don't have to do it, but if they do it, they will get rewarded for it. It'll be valid. It'll be accepted. And some people, fasting is not valid for them, nor is it obligatory. And some people, fasting is not valid, and therefore it's not valid, but it is obligatory upon them. You guys see that? It's going to make sense because I was looking like, what? All right, it's going to make sense. You'll see, I promise. So let's look at it in detail. So let's first of all look at the conditions for the obligation of fasting. When does fasting become obligatory on the ayn, on the individual? The first condition is al-Islam. The person would have to be Muslim. Otherwise, fasting wouldn't be what? Wouldn't be obligatory. Fasting is obligatory on the Muslims, on the believers. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, He says, Ya ayyuha alladhina amanu kutiba alaykum as-siyam. Oh, you who believe, fasting has been what? Prescribed upon you. Okay, so the first condition is what? Al-Islam. And this is true for all the ibadat. All the acts of worship are required for what? The Muslims. Second one, al-bulugh. Maturity. Person has to be what? They have to reach the age of maturity. They have to be pubescent at the very least. Okay? That's the second condition for what? Obligation, which means if a person was not pubescent, fasting wouldn't be obligatory upon them. The third one is al-aql. They have to have their faculties. They have to have intellect. They have to have their sanity. Okay? Which means if a person were legally insane, or a person was someone who they had a condition which affected their ability to have an intention, to resolve, to perform an act of worship, that person would not be what? Required to fast. Like a person who suffers from dementia. Okay? That person is not required to fast. The last one, al-qudratu alayh. The ability to what? To fast. The capability, the physical capability to what? To endure fasting. What's the proof for al-bulugh wal-aql? We already mentioned the proof for Islam. What's the proof for al-bulugh wal-aql? Maturity, pubescence, and having your faculties. The proof is the athar, the narration collected by Al-Bukhari, Muslim, on the authority of Ali. Collected by Al-Bukhari only, Al-Bukhari, on the authority of Ali, in which he said, أَمَا عَلِمْتَ أَنَّ الْقَلَمَ رُفِعَ عَنْ ثَلَاثٍ الصَّبِي حَتَّى يُدْرِكْ وَالْمَجْنُونَ حَتَّى يُفِيقْ وَالنَّائِمْ حَتَّى يَسْتَيْقِظْ. So he said in this narration, Ali, he said, are you not aware that the pen has been lifted for three people? There are three people who what? They're not held accountable. They're not expected to do certain things. They're not obligated. They have no obligations. The first one, as-sabi hatta yudrik. The young person until he attains what? Puberty. Wal-majnoon hatta yufiq. And the one who has lost his faculties until what? He regains his faculties. Wan-na'im. And the one who is sleeping until he what? Awakens from sleep. So three people, the pen has been raised. And that's the proof for what? The fact that you have to be pubescent in order for it to be obligatory. And you have to be, you have to have your faculties about yourself. What about the proof for al-qudra? The ability. You have to have the physical ability. We're going to talk about this in more detail when we get to the hadith. But the proof for this is the statement of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala in which He says, first of all, He said, when He says, وَعَلَى الَّذِينَ يُطِيقُونَهُ فِدْيَةٌ طَعَامُ مِسْكِينٍ. He says, and for those who can fast but do so with hardship, they do so with great difficulty, then rather than fast, and a ransom or an expiation or an alternative has been imposed upon them, that they feed for every day a what? A poor person. So rather than fast, they've been told to do what? To pay an expiation. Okay? So if this is the case for the one who can fast but does so with great hardship, it's even more true for the one who cannot fast. You guys see that? طيب. So وَالْقُدْرَةُ عَلَيْهِ. Okay, the ability. So these are the four conditions for what fasting to be obligatory on a particular individual. Meaning, if a person was a Muslim, but he hadn't reached puberty, fasting would not be obligatory. Person is pubescent. He has his faculties, and he's able-bodied. He's not ill, not suffering from any type of illness, but he's not a Muslim. He would not be what? Obligated. If a person was Muslim and pubescent and had his faculties, but did not have the physical capability, he would not be obligated. You guys see that? So this is what we're talking about. A person being obligated to fast, an individual, specific individual. Now let's come to a sihha, validity. So again, we said there's some people who what? Their fasting is what? Valid, even though they're not required. And some people who are required, but it won't be valid. Okay, they're required to fast, but if they fasted, it wouldn't be valid. This is the one where I was like, how can that be the case? And you're going to see, inshallah ta'ala. So the first one, shurut al-sihha, the first condition for validity is, again, al-Islam. So just like it's not obligatory on the one who's not Muslim, it's also not what? It's not correct. It's not acceptable. And this is critical. Because we have a trend nowadays where you have something called Islamic Awareness Week. Or you have Fast-a-thon. You have different programs that are often done in universities where, or even, it may not be a university, but uses universities where you have an MSA, Muslim Student Association, and they will encourage what? The non-Muslims to fast with the Muslims, to experience it, see what it's like. Okay, they encourage them to what? To fast. Okay? And in Islam, we don't have worship which is abath. We don't have a such thing as a worship which we do just for the sake of doing it. We just don't have that. We don't have that in Islam. That when we worship to get Allah's reward. When we encourage people to worship, we encourage them to get Allah's reward. And so therefore, we wouldn't encourage someone to fast who will not get rewarded for the fast. And it's almost like making a mockery of the good deed. And Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala spoke about this in the Quran when He said, وَمَا مَنَعَهُمْ أَن تُقْبَلَ مِنْهُمْ نَفَقَاتُهُمْ إِلَّا أَنَّهُمْ كَفَرُوا بِاللَّهِ وَبِرَسُولِهِ. And nothing prevented their charitable offerings from being accepted from them except that they had disbelieved in Allah and His Messenger. Meaning what? When a person disbelieves, nothing he does from good will be what? Accepted. Okay, we have to understand that. So we don't encourage the non-Muslims to what? To fast. We don't encourage them to wear what? Hijab. We just don't do that. Okay? We don't encourage them, come and pray with us. We don't do that. Because we don't want to make a mockery of what? Of our acts of worship. We want to tell them to come and pray when we know your prayer won't be accepted. And we don't have offering prayer knowing full well it won't be accepted. We don't have that in the deen. So for example, a person doesn't pray when he doesn't have wudu. He doesn't do that because we don't have in our deen prayer as just prayer knowing prayer won't be accepted. No, we don't have that in the deen. So we don't encourage the non-Muslims to what? To offer these acts of worship because it won't be accepted. It won't be valid. The second condition for validity is inqita' dam al-hayd, that the woman has a monthly visitor. And when that monthly visitor comes, she's not allowed to what? Fast. And in order for a fast to be valid, the blood of hayd, the blood of this menses, has to what? Has to cease and desist. Now here's a person who what? Is obligated to fast, but if they fasted, it wouldn't be valid. See that? Obligated to fast because they have Islam, they're Muslim, they're pubescent, they have their intellect and their faculties about themselves, and they're what? They're capable, physically capable of fasting, but if they fasted, it wouldn't be valid. Because one of the conditions for validity is what? That this menses has to what? Cease and desist. Make sense? Add to that an-nifas, the blood of what? They call postpartum bleeding. Postpartum bleeding, which is what? The blood after what? Childbirth. That has to also what? Cease and desist. And it's a condition for the validity of fasting. Even though she has the 4 conditions for wujub, she doesn't have one of the conditions of what? Of validity. And the proof for this, there are a number of a hadith. One is a hadith of Abi Sa'id al-Khudri collected by Bukhari Muslim, in which the Prophet said, أَلَيْسَ الْمَرْأَةَ إِذَا حَاضَتْ لَمْ تُصَلِّ وَلَمْ تَصُمْ. Is it not the case that a woman, if she experiences this monthly visitor, then she doesn't pray and she doesn't fast? Okay, isn't that the case? We also have the hadith that a woman came, it's collected by Bukhari Muslim. A woman came to Aisha and she said, what's the deal with the haid? What's the deal with a woman on her menses? That she doesn't pray and she doesn't fast, but she makes up the fast and doesn't make up the prayer. Explain this to me. It just doesn't make sense. So Aisha, she said, أَحَرُورِيَّةٌ أَنْتِ. Are you one of those people who go to extremes and have a very extreme interpretation of the religion, and they create what? Confusion for others by asking what? Asking these types of questions. Right? So then she said, لَسْتُ بِحَرُورِيَّةٍ وَلَكِنِّي أَسْأَلُ. She said, I'm not one of those people, I'm just asking it, I'm curious about this. So then Aisha, she said, كَانَ يُصِيبُنَا ذَلِكَ في عهد رسول الله صلى الله عليه وسلم فنؤمر بقضاء الصوم ولا نؤمر بقضاء الصلاة. She said this used to happen in the time of the Prophet, and we were ordered to what? To make up the missed fast, but we were not ordered to make up the missed prayers. So Aisha radiallahu anha was teaching her that this is what Allah said and what His Messenger legislated, and we just follow it. And if we can't make, basically heads or tails of it, that doesn't change the fact that what? This is the deen. And it's not always necessary that we what? Understand Allah's command, but rather that we what? Comply with it. You guys understand that? It's not always necessarily necessary that we what? We understand Allah's command, but that we comply with it. And this is a good qa'idah, a good principle that Aisha is teaching us, because a lot of people, their compliance with a command, they make it conditional, they make it hinge on what? On understanding it. So if I don't understand the wisdom behind it, I'm not going to do it. We don't have that in the deen of Allah. That's not the way of what? The early Muslims with whom Allah was well pleased. Another thing this teaches us is that you can't do what? When it comes to ibadat, you can't make qiyas. You can't make analogy with what? The acts of worship. I see that because the acts of worship are what we call ta'abbudiyya. There's something which their true meaning and understanding comes from who? Allah. Allah knows why it's like this and not like that. He knows, and we don't always what? No, because it's what? It's purely what? Worship. It's purely worship. So therefore, if Allah says, in my religion, if you don't fast, you have to make up the fast. If you don't pray, you don't have to make up the prayer. This is not something that you say, okay, well, you know, if we apply the rule of analogy, if you make up the fast, you just have to make up the prayer. If you don't make up the prayer, you don't have to make up the fast. That's what applying analogy. But this is teaching us what? You can't do that when it comes to what? Worship. Because worship is purely what? Legislation from Allah. That this is what pleases Him. And there might not necessarily always be what? Be a logical explanation as far as we can fathom. You guys understand that? So that being the case, you can't make qiyas, you can't make analogy when it comes to what? Ibadat. So if Allah says the mincing woman or the woman on her menses has to what? Make up the missed days of fasting, she has to make it up. And if He says she doesn't have to make up the salat, she doesn't have to make it up. And our job is not to always comprehend, but to comply. طيب. So we mentioned 3 conditions for validity. The first one, al-Islam. The second one, inqita' dam al-hayd, that the menses has to stop. Also, al-nifas has to come to an end. Postpartum bleeding. Number 4, at-tamyiz. At-tamyiz, which is a little bit different from being pubescent. At-tamyiz means that the child has reached an age where they can what? They have what they call the age of discernment. Okay? So basically the child reaches an age where they can what? Distinguish between right and wrong and have what? A niyyah. Have an intention to what? To do a certain thing. Have a resolve to do a certain thing. When a child reaches that age, the age of tamyiz, fasting is what? Valid. If they haven't reached that age, fasting is not valid. You guys see that? So if they reach that threshold, are they required to fast? But if they fast, it'll be what? Valid, and they'll be rewarded for it. You guys see that? So this is an example of someone who's not required to fast, but their fasting will be accepted. It'll be valid. You guys see that? طيب, mumtaz. What's the proof for that? Number of ahadith. One of them is the famous hadith of Rubayy' bint Mu'awwad. The hadith where she talks about how the Prophet ﷺ sent a crier to proclaim amongst the people, whoever amongst you has eaten, this was the day of Ashura, the first day when it was what? Legislated the fasting of Ashura. So the Prophet said, whoever amongst you has eaten, then let him what? Not eat for the rest of the day. And whoever amongst you has not eaten, then let him not eat for the rest of the day, because today is the day of Ashura. So she said, we used to fast this day. This was before the obligation of Ramadan, when Ashura was obligatory. That was the fast of the Muslims at first. So she said, we used to fast it, and our children would fast it with us. And whenever they would cry and become impatient and want food, we would give them something to what? Distract them. Some doll, they would like make a little makeshift doll or toy and give it to them to what? To distract them until the time for iftar had come. Al-Muhim, this is a perfect example of what? Of young children fasting and their fast being accepted. We also have the famous athar in which Umar ibn Khattab, he came across a man who was inebriated, who was drunk in the daytime of Ramadan. He came across him and he slapped him. And he said, Sakran wa sibyan nasiyam. He said, drunk, and our children are fasting. Our children are what? Are fasting. Another indication that the children during the time of the companions used to what? Used to fast. They would be rewarded for their fast. But we also have the before I say that, let me say this. Okay, so we have these indications that if they fast, their fasting will be valid. Because we don't have in Islam fasting, other than, okay, maybe I'll make one exception to this. Even then it's not the case though. No, I won't even make an exception. So we don't have in Islam fasting just for what? Just for the sake of fasting. That what? You're fasting what? To get Allah's reward. Okay, we don't have that. طيب. How do we reconcile between that and the athar of Ali, in which he said, أما علمت أن القلم رفع عن ثلاث He said, are you not aware that the pen has been raised for what? For 3. And he mentioned one of them, as-sabi hatta yudrik, the young person until he reaches what? Until he reaches puberty. So the pen has been raised. So how does he get rewarded if the pen has been raised? Any takers?
That's with regards to punishment.
Ahsant. That there's two pens. There's the pen of thawab and the pen of iqab, the pen of punishment, the pen of being held accountable. So the pen that's been raised is the pen of what? Accountability and punishment. Not the pen of what? Thawab. Meaning that if the child does a good deed, they'll get a reward for that. But if they do something wrong, they won't be what? Held accountable that until they reach the age of what? Puberty. And the proof for this is the hadith collected by Muslim on authority of Ibn Abbas. The Prophet was traveling, and on his journey he came across rakab. He came across a group of travelers, and when he passed by, there was a woman who had a little child with her. So she raised up the child like this. Okay? So maybe the child was like 7 or 8, something like that. So she raised up the child like this. And she said, Ya Rasulullah, Ali hada hajj. Can this child make hajj? Qala na'am, walaki ajr. He said, yes, this child can make hajj and you will get a reward. Not that you will get the reward, but you will get a reward. Which teaches that the parents will what? Will share in the reward of the child if they encourage them to do good deeds. So don't be the parent who just sits back and waits for your child to become what? Pubescent. Before you start teaching them what? How to pray. Before you have your daughter wear the scarf, dress modestly. Before you encourage your children to what? To fast. Or before you take them with you for Hajj and Umrah. Leash, because they're going to get the reward and you're going to share in the reward. You guys see that? So when they pray, you'll share in the reward for prayer. When they fast, you'll share in the reward for fasting. When they wear the hijab, you'll share in the reward for that. So, na'am walaki ajr. Yes, and you will get what? You will get a reward. So don't ever forget that. Don't ever forget that, ya ikhwan. طيب, so we mentioned so far 4, right? طيب, number 5, that you have to have what? Your faculties. So not only are your faculties a condition for wujub, a condition for obligation, but they're also a condition for validity. So a person who does not have their faculties, not only are they not obligated to fast, if they fasted, it wouldn't be accepted. So now this is critical. You might say, well, okay, what's significant about that? Or how is it practically, important? It's practically important because you have people sometimes who what? They lose consciousness. Oh Allah, they lose consciousness in Ramadan. And so when they lose consciousness, they don't have what? They don't have their faculties. Is that not so? So that will produce a ruling about that day or those days of fasting when they didn't have consciousness. You guys see that? So let's say we have a person who starts out fasting and then loses his consciousness and remains unconscious until, let's say, Salat al-Isha or Fajr the next day. What does he do about that day and the beginning of the next day? So now we're looking at basically 2 days, right? So those 2 days, he didn't have the intention. He couldn't have the intention. He didn't have what? His faculties. And so therefore, those days he has to what? Make up. You guys see that? So that's how it's practically applicable. The aql part of it, or the intellect, faculties. Last but not least, from the 6 conditions of validity is a niyyah. You have to have an intention when you fast. You have to intend to fast. And you can't just fast by accident or by happenstance. And we gave the example earlier about the guy who goes the whole day and doesn't eat anything and says, oh, I've been fasting. No, you haven't been fasting because you didn't have a niyyah. We do believe that. This is evidenced by the famous hadith of Al-Khattab, collected by Bukhari Muslim, which the Prophet said, إِنَّمَا الْأَعْمَالُ بِالنِّيَّاتِ. Actions are judged solely by the intentions behind them. Actions are judged solely by the intentions behind them. Got it? Makes sense? All right, there's a mas'ala that's going to come later, and that's the mas'ala of tabyeet and niyyah. You have to have the niyyah the night before. We're going to talk about that in detail when we get to that hadith. Go ahead, sister.
Can we just run down those 6 again? Can you go through
Yeah, sure.
just the list?
Just the bullets.
Yes, yes.
Okay. First one we said was al-Islam. Second one, inqita' dam al-hayd. So the blood of menses has to cease and desist. Inqita' dam al-nifas, also the blood of al-nifas has to cease and desist. I was just trying to give the sister time to type the answer. So when you nod, I assume that you're ready for the next one. Okay. طيب, after that, number 4, we said a tamyiz, that you have to reach the age of what? Discernment. The child has to reach the age of discernment. Number 5, we said, don't tell me. I'm just a little slow. I'm getting old. Type number 5, we said, was you have to have your faculties. You have to have your intellect, right? You have to have your faculties, intellect, al-aql. And last but not least, an-niyya, the intention. You have to have the intention. Tafadali. Number 4, the age of discernment, at-tamyiz. The third one, that was in the fast, postpartum bleeding. Postpartum bleeding was number 3. Huh?
In regards to the menses and the postpartum bleeding,
Uh-huh.
is it permissible to, or is it allowed to feed a poor?
No, not for that. And we're going to talk in detail about when the kafara is in play. Feeding the 4-person, when that's in play. We're going to talk in detail about that, when that's in play. But that's not applicable to the woman who's menstruating or the woman who's in postpartum bleeding.
And with the niyyah, is it something like a verbal, where you actually have to say that I intend to fast?
No, a niyyah is never verbal, but rather, and we're going to talk about this as well, but the niyyah is never verbal, but rather it is the resolve in the heart, and also actions that a person might do which indicate. Actions that he might do that indicate. So either one of those or both are sufficient. So it's not a thing where he has to stop and actually go, and have, I'm developing this resolve. No, he could do actions which are indicative of the fact that he has the resolve. Like what? Like make suhoor. Or set his alarm to get up for suhoor. You guys see that? Those are actions he does which indicate I have what? I have the resolve to fast tomorrow. Right? You guys see that? Yeah, so it could be a resolve in the heart that he just gathers, or it could be what? Actions which are indicative of the presence of this resolve.
The prerequisite, one more question on the prerequisites
Uh-huh.
application. When people have mental disorders,
Uh-huh.
and you have different kinds of mental disorders. If a person has hallucinations, doesn't have any control, versus a person who is depressed.
Uh-huh.
Does it apply to both those people, or is it only to those people who don't have actual control on their?
No, it's going to apply to the people who, due to their mental illness, are unable to have a niyyah, an intention. So you have some people who their mental illness, as you said, is classified as depression, or they're at risk. You follow me? They may harm themselves. That person is still obligated to fast because they can have a niyyah, even though they have a mental disorder. But then you have people who have a mental disorder which affects their ability to what? To have this resolve. They don't know where they are. They don't know what they're doing. Those people are not obligated to fast. Make sense? طيب. Any other question? تفضل يا شيخ.
Yeah, what about people, who suffer from some kind of ailment, like diabetes?
Now we're going to talk, I promise you, we're going to talk about that in detail.
Okay.
We're going to talk about that in detail, I promise. I promise we're going to talk about it in detail. Any other questions about what we talked about? تفضل يا شيخ.
I got a quick question. So you said you have to have intention for it to be valid.
Uh-huh.
I read a narration where it was that the Prophet woke up, sallallahu alaihi wasallam, and then he asked, "Is there anything to eat?"
Mumtaz.
And then they said no. So he said, "Okay, then I'm fasting."
Jameel. And again, we're going to talk about that, but I'll just touch on it briefly. Is that there's a difference between the obligatory fast and the optional fast in terms of what? When you have to have the niyyah. When. So you always have to have niyyah. Any act of worship, you have to have niyyah. إِنَّمَا الْأَعْمَالُ بِالنِّيَّاتِ. All the acts of worship are what? Judged by the intention behind them. But the question is, when do you have to have that niyyah? In terms of what? The obligatory fast versus the non-obligatory fast. And that's an issue that we're going to talk about in detail, I promise, when we get to that hadith. اتفضلي يا أخت. Huh? Well, there's two types of intention. One of them is the intention to do the act. The intention to do the act, and that's the one that we're talking about here. I intend to what? To fast. I'm not intending to what? Diet. I'm not intending to what? To starve myself to death. I'm not going to hunger strike. I intend to what? To fast as an act of worship. So I have that intention of doing this what? This act. The second type of intention is what I think you're talking about. The right intention, which means who am I doing it for? Who am I doing it to please? You see that? And that's something that we all have to work on and make sure that we're doing it for Allah. That we're doing it for Allah. Make sense? So two types of intention. The one we're talking about here is the intention to do that particular action. Make sense? You asked some really good questions. Really good questions. All right. طيب. So now let's go now to Sunan As-Siyam. Sunan As-Siyam, now we're talking about the recommended acts, the acts that when we do them, they will do what? They will increase our fasting in reward. Things that will complete the fasting. They're like, you have that Sunday, right? Anybody like Sundays? I used to like Sundays, but I can't really, I'm getting up in age, man. I might like them, but they don't like me, But anyway, like they're like that Sunday, right? You got the banana, you got that chocolate drizzle, you got those scoops of ice cream, you got the whipped cream, but it's just not right until what? You put that cherry on top, right? And then sprinkle those nuts on there, or sprinkles. Who likes sprinkles? Don't raise your hand. That's for kids. That's for children. Don't expose yourself. Keep that between you and Allah, okay? All right, so anyway, but you guys get the point. It's what? These are the things that you put on there to what? To complete it, to make it what? Perfect. Same thing is true for what? Sunan As-Siyam, right? These are the things that we do to round out our fasting and make it what? More complete, more rewardable, more pleasing to Allah. And whenever we present our body of work, we want to present what? The most excellent body of work that we can, right? So we're going to mention 6 sunan. 6 things that we should do to what? To increase the reward for our siyam. But the first one, ta'jil al-fitr. Ta'jil al-fitr. Hastening what? The breaking of the fast. Hastening the breaking of the fast. And this is something which is mustahab, highly recommended bil ijma', by agreement of the scholars, as mentioned by Ibn Hubayrah. And the proof for this is the hadith collected by Bukhari and Muslim on the authority of Sahal ibn Sa'd al-Sa'di, in which the Prophet said, لا يزال الناس بخير ما عجلوا الفطر. People will not cease to be what? In a good state. So long as they do what? They hasten to what? To break the fast. They will not cease to be what? In a good state. So long as they do what? They hasten to break the fast. So we should be the people, ya ikhwan, who they're sitting in the mosque waiting for the iftar, or sitting at home waiting for the iftar. وَيُؤَذَّنْ. The time for salat has come, they hear the adhan, and they do what? They just sit there, and they wait, and they're watching people around them what? Eat, and they're like, they're just waiting. I don't know, what are they waiting for? God knows. But they're waiting. And then ultimately they'll what? They'll break the fast. Some of them might even wait till what? Till it starts to what? Get dark. Just before the prayer, the iqamah. They're waiting because they feel what? This ittirab, or this discomfort, this disquiet about breaking their fast. As if they're going to what? Break it too early. So they want to be 100% sure by the darkness outside or by some other indication that what? Once the time comes, we should do what? Hasten to break the fast. We shouldn't delay breaking the fast. And we shouldn't think that we're going to what? Please Allah by delaying the breaking. The opposite is correct. We please Allah by what? By hastening to break the fast. Once we're certain the time has come, we also shouldn't be like some people who misunderstand this hadith. I remember once a brother came to me and he said, I read this hadith, and so what I do is 5 minutes before iftar, I break my fast. Is this right? I said, no, akhi, no. The hadith is not telling you to what? To preempt, the time of iftar, but when the time for iftar comes, you break it, right? So you can't do it 5 minutes before. You have to do it when it happens, but do it right, what? Right when it happens. Okay? طيب, the next one, number 2, is تأخير. تفضل يونس.
Is this applicable to the obligatory?
Yeah, it's general. General for fasting in general. Yep. طيب, تأخير السحور. Delaying the pre-dawn or pre-fast meal, as-suhoor. So we hasten in breaking the fast and we delay what? The start of the fast. And the proof for this is also mustahab bil-ijma'. This is also recommended by agreement of the scholars, as mentioned by Ibn Muflih. And the proof for this is the hadith collected by Bukhari and Muslim on the authority of Anas, who asked Zayd ibn Thabit. He asked Zayd ibn Thabit. He said to him, tell me about the Prophet's suhoor. Tell me about the Prophet's suhoor. So Zayd ibn Thabit, he said, تسحرنا مع رسول الله صلى الله عليه وسلم ثم قام إلى الصلاة. He said, we took our pre-dawn meal with the Prophet. Then after we completed the meal, he stood up and he prayed. Now that right there gives you an indication that what? There was a short time between the pre-dawn meal, the pre-fast meal, and what? And that. But Anas wasn't clear how much time. So he said, كم كان بين الأذان والسحور? How much time was there between the adhan, the beginning of the time for Fajr, and his suhoor? So Zayd ibn Thabit, he responded, قدر 50 آية. He said about the time it would take to recite 50 verses. طيب يا اخوان, in سورة عما يتساءلون النبأ, how many verses in it? Like 30 something? 36, right? How long do you think it would take you to recite that? Huh? Yeah. Now add to that, 15 more ayat? 7 minutes maybe? Maybe. That shows you what? It was what? Pretty short amount of time. You guys see that? That's the point that Zayd is making. There was a short time. The Prophet delayed it. And there's also wisdom in that. And the wisdom is that the closer you make the suhoor to the start of the fast, the longer the food will remain with you, providing your body with what? With nutrients and energy. And the farther you make it away from that, the more you've what? Exhausted that, and then you have all these hours of fasting where you have no what? No nutrients and no what? And no energy being provided to the body. So think about the people who they're in the habit of making their suhoor very early on in the evening. Maybe they return home from Taraweeh and they have what? They have a big meal, okay? Then they go to sleep. In reality, while they're sleeping, they're fasting. They're fasting while they're sleeping. So they've begun their fast. So for 4 hours they're fasting, and then they begin their fast, the real fast, after Fajr. And so if we're talking about these 16, 18-hour days, the person's basically been fasting. If it's a 16-hour day, they've been fasting for 20. And if it's an 18-hour day, they've been fasting for 22 hours. You guys see that? So you're increasing the amount of what? Fasting you're doing and putting that much more what? Load and burden on the body without any what? Any nutrients or without any what? Provision or the providing of energy. So that's another wisdom behind what? Delaying the suhoor. Number 3 is that we should increase, whenever we're fasting, increase in what? The good deeds we do. We should exert a great deal of energy what? In trying to what? Get closer to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. زيادة في أعمال الخير من القراءة والذكر والصدقة وغيرها. So we should increase in our recitation of the Quran, increase in our remembrance of Allah, and increase in our giving of charity, and so on. And the proof for this, among many proofs, is the famous hadith of Ibn Abbas, collected by Bukhari, in which he said, كان النبي صلى الله عليه وسلم أجود الناس بالخير. The Prophet ﷺ was what? The most generous when it came to what? The good things. وكان أجود ما يكون في رمضان. And he was the most generous that he would be throughout the year in what? In the month of Ramadan. So he what? He would basically ramp up. He would basically increase his intensity in the month of Ramadan. We also see it from the hadith of Aisha, the last 10 days that the Prophet worshipped Allah and exerted himself like he did no other what? No other days. We also have the statement of Aisha in which she said that when the last 10 days would come, the Prophet did what? أحيا ليلة وأيقظ أهله وشد مئزره. That the Prophet used to do what? He would spend the whole night in prayer. He'd wake up his family so they would do the same, and he would do what? Tighten his waist wrapper. It means what? he would totally what? Step away from intimacy and being with his wives. This is the time for what? Worship, and no time for what? For play, so to speak. So these are all indications that what? A person should what? Ramp up his intensity and exert himself in the worship of Allah in Ramadan in general, and specifically or especially in the last 10 days. طيب, so that's how many so far?
3.
La. Is it 3? طيب, you're right, 3. Just testing you guys. Okay. طيب. طيب, number 4. قوله جهرا إذا شتم. That he should say out loud if he is what? If he is insulted, or if he's attacked, or if somebody basically gets confrontational with him, he says out loud, Inni imru'un sa'im. I am what? A fasting person. He says it what? Out loud. He tells the person, I'm what? Fasting. He diffuses the situation by what? Telling the person, I am fasting. I will not do what? I will not stoop to your level because I am fasting. The proof of this is the hadith collected by Bukhari Muslim on the authority of Abu Hurairah, in which the Prophet said, إذا كان يوم صوم أحدكم فلا يرفث يومئذ ولا يصخب فإن شاتمه أحد أو قاتله فليقول إني امرؤ صائم. So in this hadith, the Prophet said, in the hadith of Abu Hurairah, he said, if one of you is fasting, then let him not speak and use foul language. Nor should he do what? Nor should he say anything which is what? Indecent or insulting or derogatory. Shouldn't curse. And if someone comes and they do what? They curse him or insult him or they try to provoke him, then he should say, Inni imru'un sa'im. He should say, I am what? I'm a fasting person. Unlike you, I don't know what you're doing, but as for me, I'm fasting, and so what? I don't use that type of language, and I don't get into what? To arguments. I don't get into debates. I don't get into any confrontations. I don't get into any confrontations when I'm what? When I'm fasting. طيب, so that's 4. Number 5. When he breaks his fast, he should make what? Dua. He should make dua, a supplication, when he breaks his fast. Because it has been authentically narrated from the Prophet ﷺ that he said, ثلاثة لا ترد دعوتهم. There are 3 people who their supplication will not be rejected. It will not be turned back. And one of them he mentioned was what? As-sa'im hina yuftir. The fasting person when he breaks his fast. The other version of it says what? As-sa'im. Okay? As-sa'im. The fasting person. It doesn't even mention what? When he's breaking his fast. Just mentions the fasting person in general. So the fasting person should be keen throughout the day to what? Make dua. And we see this supported by the ayah, which we're going to talk about that in detail tomorrow. But also specifically when he breaks his fast, he should be keen to what? To make dua. Is there a specific dua that he should make? Allah knows best. What has been narrated, none of it is authentic. So the famous one that we know, and there's a few other ones, or at least one other one that I'm aware of, is the famous one in which the Prophet was reported to have said that he used to say when he used to break his fast, he used to say, ذهب الظمأ وابتلت الأروق وثبت الأجر إن شاء الله. ذهب الظمأ, the thirst has gone. وابتلت الأروق, and these veins which have become dry have now become moist again. وثبت الأجر, and the reward is what? Confirmed, inshallah, by Allah's will, by Allah's leave. So this is a famous one. It's been authenticated by some contemporaries, highly respected contemporaries. But Allah knows best. Its authenticity is what? Is in question at the very least. طيب. So we should make a general dua, should make anything what? Anything specific. طيب, ثم بعد ذلك, the last تفضل.
If you don't say the dua that you mentioned or the other one, the
Uh-huh.
common dua,
Mhm.
can you just pray, say Bismillah and open the fast? Is that okay?
What do you mean? By make iftar, you mean? Well, you're going to make iftar and then make dua. So what you do is basically you break your fast and then immediately you make dua. Don't make dua and then waste time without breaking your fast.
With the dua, the actual dua that you made, do you have to use the dua that you stated, or can you just make any dua?
Well, that's the conversation we're having, is that the specific supplications that have been narrated, their authenticity is in question. So make a general dua for anything. Because the hadith, which is authentic, says what? that the prayer of the fasting person will be what? Accepted, not be rejected. That's general. Whatever he prays for. But as far as specific ones, like the one that's been narrated that we just mentioned, there's another one. Those we're saying it's best if you want. If you avoid those and you make a general dua. Is that your question?
That was part of the question. The
Mhm.
other one was like the way I've grown up is you pray the dua first and then break the fast.
Eh.
The dua that
Okay, that's a good question. Now I'm gonna bring this to you all. Okay. What do you guys think about that protocol? So now,
The hadith says,
the adhan has been called. I know that what? It's time for what? Iftar. So I start what? Making dua. Okay? Allahumma rzuqni rizqan wasi'an طيبا مباركا فيه اللهم اهدني فيمن هديت وتولني فمن توليت إلى آخره ربنا آتنا في الدنيا حسنة وفي الآخرة حسنة whatever. Okay, so you're making these different what? General supplications. What do you guys think about that protocol? تفضل يا أخت. Yeah.
But it's not correct because you're supposed to hasten in breaking the fast.
Mumtaz. So what you do is you break the fast and then you follow with what? The dua. Should be the opposite, because the more dua that I make, the more I'm delaying the suhoor. I'm missing out on what? On this sunnah. Whereas if I break the fast and then make dua, I won't miss out on any sunnah. In fact, I'm what? I'm getting both of the sunnah.
So not talking about the duas general. What
Uh-huh.
I'm saying is the way we were raised, and the thing is, we were taught to say Allahumma laka sumtu wa bika amantu.
Right, that's another famous one.
So you pray that, and that is the act that is required to open your fast.
No. There's no specific dua, and that's not something that the breaking the fast is conditional on that. No, that you break your fast,
And you can do that just
and then after that and then after that you make any dua, any general dua, but don't put the dua before the break and then make the dua. Mumtaz. طيب, last but not least, when you break your fast, from the sunnah of fasting is when you break your fast on something specific. And that's what? Dates. Preferably an odd number. And if there are no dates present, then what? Water. Dates, no dates, water. No water, some of the scholars say anything sweet. Anything sweet. And that's because medically, after you've been fasting all day, to have that burst of sugar is good for your body. So dates, and then water, and then some scholars say anything sweet. And the proof for dates and water is a hadith collected by the hadith collected by Ahmad wa Ashab al-Sunan, in which the Prophet said, this is the hadith of Salman ibn Amr al-Dabbi, إِذَا أَفْطَرَ أَحَدُكُمْ فَلْيُفْطِرْ عَلَى مَاءٍ. على تمر. If one of you breaks his fast, and let him break his fast upon what? Dates. Then he said, فَإِن لَمْ يَجِدْ فَمَنْ لَمْ يَجِدْ فَلْيُفْطِرْ عَلَى مَاءٍ فَإِنَّهُ لَهُ طَهُورٌ. So whoever doesn't find dates, then let him break his fast with what? Water, because it's what? It's purifying, has that purifying effect. Okay? So based upon this hadith, we have this tartib in terms of order of priority. Dates, if they're available, and then what? Then water. Okay? So we mentioned 6 sunan. Let's recap quickly. The first one, hasten to break the fast. Second one, delay the suhoor. Number 3, increase your good deeds. Number 4, saying out loud if somebody basically attacks you, what? I'm fasting. Number 5, make dua when you break your fast. Number 6, break the fast with dates preferably, and then if dates are not present, then water. Okay? All right, so now we're done with, we got to do discouraged practices, right? I will do that quickly, discouraged practices. Let me say this, ya Ikhwan, that we have to understand that there are certain things that we may do that, although they are not mufattirat, although they're not something which will break the fast, if you do them, they will violate the spiritual sanctity of the fast and could render the fast null and void. And if they don't render the fast null and void, they may do what? They may totally what? Nullify the reward you get for the fast. And if they don't nullify the reward, they have the potential to do what? To decrease it, to limit the reward we receive. And I want you to pay attention to one thing too, is that when we do any act of worship, we have two aims, two objectives in doing that act of worship. The first objective is to get credit for doing the act of worship and remove ourselves from the blame of not doing it. That's our first objective. We want to be from the people who are written down to have what? To have prayed. Basically checked off. Did he pray, did not pray? He prayed. You guys see that? So that's the first thing. We're trying to what? To be from the people who have what? Fulfilled their religious obligation to what? To do that deed. The second objective is what? To get the thawab, to get the reward for the deed. So what happens sometimes, ya ikhwan, is that we do the deed and we get one of those, but we don't get the other, and sometimes we get neither. So in the case of the one who does some of these things we're going to mention, they may get the first one. Did he fast? Yes, he fasted. Did he get a reward? No. You guys see that? That can potentially happen. We don't want to be from that group. So sometimes you do some of these things and what? You get nothing. Sometimes you only get credit for what? For fasting, although you don't get what? A reward. And sometimes you get the credit and the reward, but the reward is what? Diminished because of the deeds that you do. So we're going to mention some of these, what we call makruhat of the siyam. Disliked practices which can decrease the reward and maybe even negate it altogether. What's the proof, first of all, of the things that I said? That there is something that what? Can potentially what? Cause our reward to be diminished or cause us not to get any reward. The proof is the famous hadith collected by Ibn Majah and Ahmad, wherein the Prophet said, رُبَّ صَائِمًا لَيْسَ لَهُ مِنْ صِيَامِهِ إِلَّا الْجُوعَ. That perhaps a fasting person will not get anything from his fasting except hunger, right? Except hunger and thirst. So this is a proof that some people, they fast and they don't get anything out of it. They get nothing out of it. We also have the famous hadith where the Prophet said that the ajr for the salat, a person will pray and he'll maybe get what? He'll get a third of its value, half of its value, a quarter of its value, what? A tenth of its value. You guys know that hadith. So that means that what? The reward, because of something he did or didn't do, failed to do, what? The reward was what? Diminished. And the Prophet said, don't steal, don't be from the people who what? Steal from their prayer. Meaning what? They do things that cause what? The reward to be what? To be diminished. So let's mention three really quickly. The first one, al-kadhib, lying. Lying is one of those things that if you do it when you're fasting, it will do what? It will at the very least diminish the reward and could do what? Nullify it altogether. Bidalil, this is proven by the hadith of Bukhari on the authority of Abu Hurairah, in which the Prophet said, "Man lam yada' qawl az-zur wal 'amal bihi wal jahl, falaysa lillahi haja an yada' ta'amahu wa sharabah." He said, whoever does not abstain from falsehood in word and deed and ignorant behavior while fasting, فَلَيْسَ لِلَّهِ حَاجَةٌ, then Allah has no need for him to leave his food and drink. Now I want you to pay attention to the word the Prophet uses, that Allah doesn't have any need. I'm going to ask you honestly, even if the person didn't lie, would Allah have a need? No. So when the Prophet said Allah doesn't have a need, obviously he means something else. He means what? That Allah will not what? Will not accept it. The person runs a risk of his fasting not being accepted if he what? If he bears false testimony in Ramadan. But the next one, الرفث والشتم والمشاجرة. A person should not engage in foul and indecent speech. Shouldn't engage in what? Insults, derogatory speech, cursing others, and should not engage in arguing when they're fasting. This is critical for us to concentrate on, Lish, because fasting, just by its nature, tends to invoke some tension. It tends to make people what? Agitated. Because they're hungry. They're hungry, and that makes them a little what? Agitated, a little on edge.
You mentioned those three again?
So a rafath, foul, indecent speech, person's like saying things that are what? Indecent, foul, unbecoming. A shatam is when you insult someone, you curse them, you say derogatory things towards them. And al-mushajara is argumentation. So again, as we said, that people tend to have, they're a little tense, they're a little agitated just by virtue of what? Of fasting. Add to that, in these days that we'll be fasting, these are the hottest and longest days of the year. So this will add something to the what? That agitation that people feel. And so tempers may flare, fuses become shorter, and people may be more inclined to what? To lash out. So it's incumbent to bear in mind that you have to maintain a certain type of decorum when you're fasting. You have to really, restrain yourself and practice restraint when you're fasting. Because one of the things that will decrease the reward and can potentially nullify the reward are these three things: arguing, speaking indecently, and cursing and insulting others. The Prophet said in the hadith, as-sawmu junnah, fasting is a shield. فَإِذَا كَانَ يَوْمُ صَوْمِ أَحَدِكُمْ فَلَا يَرْفَثْ وَلَا يَسْخَبْ. He said, so if one of you is fasting, then let him not speak what? Indecently, and let him not what? Argue with others, or speak in a way which is derogatory or deriding others. And this is critical in the time in which we live, when people have a tendency to what? Be quick to insult. So people really have to be mindful of the effect that insulting, that tendency to insult others can have on their fasting. The last thing we'll mention, number 3, is everything, we should avoid everything and anything which opposes and contradicts the spirit of fasting. What is the spirit of fasting, and what is its wisdom, its primary wisdom, the primary objective of fasting? To obtain piety, taqwa. So everything that contradicts what? That objective is something you should avoid, okay? Anything that goes against what? Being pious and being a person of taqwa, you should what? You should avoid while fasting. And the proof of this is the statement of Jabir ibn Abdullah, the famous Sahabi al-Jalil, the famous companion, in which he said, إِذَا سُمْتَ فَلْيَسُمْ سَمْعُكَ وَبَصَرُكَ وَلِسَانُكَ عَنِ الْكَذِبِ وَالْمَحَارِمِ. He said, if you fast, then let your hearing, your sight, and your tongue fast with you from every illegal thing. وَدَعَنْكَ أَذَى الْجَارِ, and avoid harming your neighbor. Neighbor, Allah knows best, is just what? An example. Avoid harming anyone. وَلْيَكُنْ عَلَيْكَ وَقَارٌ وَسَكِينَةٌ, and let tranquility and calmness and decorum be your cloak. Wear it. Demonstrate it. وَلَا يَكُنْ صَوْمُكَ وَفِطْرُكَ سَوَاءً, and don't let your fasting and your not fasting be the same. Let there be a marked difference in your behavior when you're fasting, to the point that I know he must be fasting. You guys see that? I just know he's fasting. He's in the zone. You guys see that? That's how we should be. Okay? طيب. So that being said, we have completed the introduction. Any questions about anything we covered thus far? Any questions? Tafadhal, Musa. No, I cannot do that. Sorry. Yeah, which one you want? Which one you want? I'm sorry. Last one, okay. So Jabir ibn Abdullah, the Sahabi, he said, if you fast, then let your hearing, your sight, and your tongue fast with you from every illegal thing. And leave off, avoid harming your neighbor. And really harming your neighbor here is what? It means really, it's just a mithal, it's an example. He really means what? Harming anyone. وَلْيَكُنْ عَلَيْكَ وَقَارٌ وَسَكِينَةٌ, and let calmness, tranquility, and decorum be your what? Your cloak. Wear it, show it, demonstrate it, manifest it. وَلَا يَكُنْ صَوْمُكَ, and don't let your fasting, وَفِطْرُكَ, and your not fasting, sawa, be the same. Got it? All right. Okay, so now what we have is we have the second part of today's program, which is going to be the rules and regulations of the ahkam of fasting from Bulugh al-Maram. I think everybody has the sheets. We're going to take a 5-minute break for the bathroom, and then we're going to resume. Okay? هذا وصلى الله وسلم وبارك على نبينا محمد.